you've been hearing quite a lot of things about what's going to happen next in these 2 very interesting and challenging days. I would like to make a point about what's happening now and what we should be aware of. So to do that, of course, we look back, as many of the other speakers have been doing. So 1967, The Graduates has a very interesting scene in that movie where Dustin Hoffman is discussing with one of the other characters, and he gets this sort of like beat of a piece of advice: plastics, right? What do you mean by that? There's a great future in plastic, right? That was like the piece of advice in the 60s. This technology is going to change the world. And one of the things that we wonder now is where we are with our technology. And my take is that it's not going to be so interesting what is going to happen next, but we should be paying attention to what is already happening now. And when we are, for example, protesting, as over here in Korea, how much of that technology is helping us, how much of that technology is hindering us, how much of that is surveillance, how much of that is actually rebellion in some ways. And again, to sort of like get the perspective of these things, it's useful to go back a little. And in '98, Nicholas Negroponte wrote a piece for Wired, which was called Beyond Digital, where he was basically saying that thing that you see over there, like at a certain point, digital will just become trivial, banal. It will be just like air and drinking water. We will not pay attention to it. We will just notice when it's not there, right? Its absence, not its presence. And if you think about the environment in which we live today, I would argue that we are definitely there now. So we are sort of like worried about only if the Wi-Fi over here is not working or if you don't have enough buzz on your phone, not really about whether technology is here, if digital is here or not. And there's a number of points that we can make, right? This process of digitization that we've been through and that is, of course, still ongoing, sort of like blurred the distinction between products and services. That's one of the first things that we've been through, to the point that we are not really caring about our phones as phones, as objects, as products, but more as avatars of the services that allow us to actually use, right? The second point could possibly be that digitization has also blurred the differences between digital and physical, right, in many different ways. And I'd love to have an example of a rather silly thing, using the PlayStation Move. So this is a game, and it's a digital game, but it's played without a screen, and all of the interactions are actually physical. It's a sort of like game where you need to unbalance your opponent when the moment is right? So there's no screen inside, but it's a digital game. And digitization has also blurred the distinction between producers and consumers, right? We all know that. We have like thousands of examples with companies been sort of like, the name has been dropped a number of times. But everywhere, we are both, the receivers and the people who provide the core of whatever services and products we're using. So a couple of weeks ago, we were having one of those love fests on Twitter where you basically have so many people chiming in into a thread that at a certain point you just go by +1, +30 user IDs because that's all the space that you have. And somebody made a point of saying that I was sort of lucky or very smart because my user ID there and on social media is pretty short. It's just my last name. And I was just going, it's very much like Batman, right? Because the very idea is that Batman is not Archibald or Charles Batman, right? It's just Batman. And so that's just like my last name. And somebody just retorted, just saying, well, yeah, but he's really Bruce Wayne, right? Which is a fair point, right? But the thing is, nobody knows that in the fictional, DC universe. That's a different thing. So we are sort of like not getting the perspective of being outside of the fictional universe they're living in, where nobody knows that, and it is just Batman. So what does this have to do with the thing? Well, we're there. This is the conundrum that we're sort of like living through. The idea that we still consider digital and physical and products and services things that are separated, things that we sort of like either work on or not work on. But the point is that people really do not care about those distinctions. They do have a feeling of Batman and Bruce Wayne as one and the same, and they can just move around and create with the things that we give them what we call emergent choreographies, right? They can basically put pieces together and do what they like. And typical example that I use is sort of like something not very pleasing, like paying your taxes. But like 20 years ago, that would have involved a lot of paper and talking to an accountant and going to offices. As of today, there's some of that, and there's some paper involved, but at least in Sweden, for example, that involves like text messages and a website and a thing I receive in my mail and no people inside. I could do it differently. That depends on me and not on the service I'm using, right? So the idea is that these are becoming experiences which are by nature unbounded, right? That's the thing. An experience has no boundaries except those that the people who are going through it put around it. And the idea that we're still using a bounded approach to creating products or services, because that's what the clients sort of like, impose on us. That's their perspective. I do have a company. I do have, something that I'm interested in, a certain service to offer. So, of course, they look at the walled garden. But that's not the way that the people using it are actually going to be using. That's not the way. The general idea is that I will put together whatever is necessary in order to get to the goals I want to actually achieve. And the idea that we can bring in something that says, this is the finished thing, and this is just what your company does, without any regard for what is happening around it, it's sort of like a little bit outdated from my perspective. This is nothing new, and for the past 20 years, we've been having things, especially in cultural studies, looking at these problems, right? Cross-media, transmedia storytelling. Some of you might know a lot about this, some of you might have heard the name. The idea of cross-media and transmedia is basically that you can tell a story, as they say, across a number of very different medias for a number of very different years, using a lot of different channels, as they call them, or mediums, in order to bring you as the audience into a universe that is deployed across a number of many different media. It's interesting and it's very solid as of now after 20 years of work and research. The problem over there is that these models, these approaches are descriptive. They're not generative. We do design. We create things that do not exist. These things, these cross-media and transmedia frameworks, are mostly approaching entertainment, which is generally not what we do, and especially they give us no tools in order to be able to say, yeah, but what am I going to do exactly? What am I going to produce? On the other side, we've been dealing with things like multi-channel for many years. It's closer to what we do. The big issue with multi-channel is that it closely resembles that, intersection from hell we've been all through. It's a lot of different paths and they do not cross and should not, because otherwise, hell breaks loose. And the big issue is that they are generative, but they are reductionist in nature. So they tend to simplify problems and tell you, well, it's either this way or that way or the highway. There's no way that you can start a transaction in a certain medium and bring it over to another medium. That's the way they are built. They're especially not systemic, which is one of the things that is important, because when we're dealing with people creating their own experiences, like by tying together different things that we didn't think about, the relationships between the different elements become one of the characteristics of what we are designing. So this is a quote from Georges Braque, the fact that relationships are the most important thing that we're dealing with. A lot of what we do in information architecture and user experience has to do with that, of course. And the best thing that you can have, if you think about the implications of this, is thinking about the way we need to shift our attention to the way these things go together. So this is an example from a book that describes system thinking theories about how the idea of opening up supermarkets out of town, so that like people will go and shop there, and that means that fewer people will shop in the high streets or downtown. But that also means that the shops will go out of business, which also means that more people will go to the supermarket. So it's not a line, but it's a reinforcing loop where things are happening because they are happening. So they happen more, and you could add more pieces. So we can't simply move from the idea that enough to consider the origin of the problem, because many elements are impacting on each other, and sometimes the relationships are not immediate to our understanding. For us, that basically means that the attention needs to shift from the tactical aspects of much of the work that we do to the more strategic point of view, or trying to figure out what the big system is going to be. And try to think about the idea of sending a message. So a very, very simple example. If you do that, you could probably just type it on a computer. You could decide to use a mobile phone, which imposes different limitations on the way that you're actually typing or swiping or tapping. But you could also decide that you write messages using lipstick on a door, and that message is not properly coming from you, right? And as crazy as it might seem, we have many people believing that you can actually communicate across dimensions, like using tools, right? Like what we do. And you could have many, many more. These are all different messages. They have somebody telling something to somebody else, right? The way the interfaces change is great. There's no single interface which is the same as the other. You know that pretty well. It's very different to write on a keyboard, on a phone, or with lipstick on a door. And the idea is that what doesn't change are the rules. The rules for sending a message to someone involve a language, involve a certain way of communicating, and those things are the foundations on which we can build things from a more strategic point of view. This is also where the thing that is cross-channel comes in, right? It's a sort of like strategic flip of the coin when it comes to the idea that we've been talking about user experiences forever. That's what we do, right? But what are the users actually doing today? Do they just use the product that your company or your client is going to be, proposing? No, they don't. They will go to IMDb if that is, convenient, and then go to a movie shop, or then, go to Netflix, or then go to somewhere else, because that's, the thing that they want to do. And cross-channel ecosystems are this idea of the connections and the elements that build up the experience of people just, traveling across the different domains that are products and services, digital and physical, producing and consuming, right? They are made of people, locations, devices, context, anything that is in there. They become places. They become places because that's where we spend a lot of time. And they are emergent structures that support emergent behavior, which means that we don't really control what people do. They can always say, oh no, I'm not going to do that, and then we'll do something else, right? Because of distractions, because of obstacles, because of more opportunities. And we've been discussing this. We've been having the double diamond all over the place for the past 2 days. But since we sort of mentioned the fact of where certain elements, like presumptive design, for example, in Leo's presentation, stand in the double diamond, the idea is that if you think about cross-channel, that's sort of like there at the beginning or even before, because the question that we try to answer is what before how we do it, right? That's the big change that we're trying to push through. So when you design from a cross-channel perspective, you always have an organizational pain, like a client is coming to you and telling you, things. And that's like the pragmatical start point, because we want to have, money in exchange for the things that we do, or recognition, or, social, benefits. But there's also the people's experience, which is the conceptual point of view. What are the users doing? So in the course of projects that we've been doing using these methodologies, for example, one on the workplace of the future, we had a question that was very simple. How do we make the workplace better? And we sort of flipped the coin and said, wait a second, What does the workplace mean to the people who are going to be using it? Let's go and ask them, what is the workplace? What is their workplace? What do they want, need, what it is especially, right? Does it involve devices, places, homes, traveling, trains? What do they do, right? And because of this, and because of this very large approach, we need to be able to build ecosystems with very few elements, and that's precisely what we try to standardize. And we have actors, and which are basically our users, but they are not just using things, they're actually making things. So we call them actors, and these are all of the agents within the ecosystem, which also implies that they could be software agents, of course, right? And actors are there because they have a future desired state that they want to achieve in some ways. They want to do something. Then we have tasks, all of the activities that are performed in the pursuit of this future desired state. And we have touch points. You know about this, but it's like the individual points of interactions that you have where you are actually sort of like moving along your path. And they live in a channel. And I will get there, but between touch points, you have seams, the connections, the relationships. These seams allow you to move from one touch point to another, and sometimes across channels, right? The channels are basically the pervasive layers that move information along. So sort of like these, giant pipes that allow people to send information from one place to the other, or that allow the system to actually move information around. And of course, then we have their relationships. The interesting part is that channels are design artifacts. They're not real in a way, right? We just, think about them. They're like pipes, as the picture was going, right? Containers, fuzzy categories. And the reason we have them over there is because they allow us to actually have a very good mental model to increase the way the ecosystem can be effective. If you think about a touch point, the touch point is a tap on a pipe that is the channel inside the ecosystem. That's where you draw or sort of like put information inside the system, you modify it, right? And a touch point is always medium specific. It's a person, it's digital, it's physical, it's a kiosk, it's a device, it's anything, but it's a very specific thing. Channels, they contain information. They are not bound by any medium. And when you have two touch points on the same channel, you have a seam between them. You can move across different touch points. When you actually have channels crisscrossing through that, you can move from one channel to the other by using certain touch points that allow you to do that. I will explain a little bit about that later. The way we build the channels is absolutely up to the project. It depends, right? You're one of the loathed, words in the profession, but they might be just because you have an enterprise model that you want to follow through. They might, come out of content analysis. They might come out of the team zone, ideas. They might be the result of user research. That really depends. The way we do these things is the traditional way. So there's nothing particularly new over there. We go through the usual stuff of having people with Post-its and pens and lots of paper around. And the initial phases when we try to collect what the users are doing have been mostly done through ethnographics, because that's the best way to capture the richness of the different, individual stories. But, we've been doing interviews as well as much as surveys. So very traditional process. What we collect at the beginning is an idea of what the people want to do. What are their goals, right? So what is that is there for you when you're talking about the workplace or education or your taxes? What is the final goal that you're trying to achieve? And these are a few examples from workshops that we run. So like about goals, and they are captured either in discursive form like this, or like through points. Learn new ways to solve problems, have fun, meet people, sort of things. And they change and vary much. Depending, some people are more, schematic, some others give you more to chew on. And then, after we have an idea of the goals, we actually ask them to tell us about their individual experiences. So we want to know what they've been going through. And this is, traditional journey mapping or whatever you want to call it. People just tell us, well, I do these things, right? And the funny thing is that over there, of course, you find a lot of linear paths because that's the way we perceive our experience. I woke up this morning, I walked out of the hotel, came to the conference, talked to people, now I'm here talking to you. But in reality, those linearity that you see over there need to be superseded by the different structure of the ecosystem. So what we do, we collect them, we get all of the pieces in place, and then either the team or the people themselves, depending on the structure of the workshops, try to come to terms with the idea that ecosystems are not linear, there's no fixed path through them, there's no arrow leading through them. So what we do is basically tell them, could you please give us an overview of your draft ecosystem, your own idea where the points that you've been touching are. And we give them sort of like a very basic grammar to do this that uses triangles for actors because they sort of resemble one of the shapes that we use for humans. Tasks are squares, touch points are circles, and of course seams are lines. We try to keep it simple because that way people can sort of get crazy and do the stuff that we normally do, right? Produce these sort of things where you have, actors and touch points and the action that they do into a sort of bewildering array of elements. And we let them go wild over these things and produce many, try to figure out what is the one that works for them. And when we're done, we try to do what is normally missing from these sort of pieces. One experience is interesting, but that's not all, because we all came over here to this conference, but we all went through a number of things that maybe very few others have been going through. Some flew in, some are from London, some come from overseas, some bicycled over here, some live in the British museums, I don't know. So it might be that we have been through different things. So we try to build a compound ecosystem, which basically means gathering groups, the design team, the people you're working with, it might be a combination of both, and try to say, now you have the individual draft ecosystem, build a giant one. Don't throw away anything, everything matters, right? And then of course you can weigh them, see which touch points have been more used and all sorts of things. And at the beginning they're very, very messy things like we're used to using post-its or sketches, but there are, lots of mistakes and lots of, oh no, I need to draw a line and then I need to connect over there. I don't really understand anymore, do it again, or just move post-its. The point that we get to at the end is going to be more interesting, but before we get there, what we do is go through the channels themselves. So we put aside the ecosystem and sort of go back to a thing that some of you might know, which is affinity diagrams. So we're basically trying to say, all right, now we have all of the elements. How do we put them together? And affinity diagrams are a good technique. There might be others, where you basically start building your own categories out of what you have. And it's normally very quick. It's normally done a number of times. And in the end, what we have is an idea that the different things that you have over there belong to different channels. So I do have over here sort of like a draft or example ecosystem that was done for a movie-going experience. This is a simplified version with just the touch points and only 3 users that are different in color, as you can see. And the idea is that you could imagine that this, if it was like 50 users or 100 users, this might be very, much larger and with many more touch points. And the things that you see are the individual parts that these people work through, and you can totally see that there were overlaps as well. The exercise that we did was basically try and figure out how the channels were working there, and the 4 channels that were identified were things like the movie themselves, or food, transport, social media, and you could have more. This depends on the goals of the project. They are not given, right? They might be wrong. They might be the wrong names. They might be the wrong way to do it. It's design, so we need to go through this thing. And what you have, the colors represent the way the channels are sort of connecting the different touch points. and you have an immediate appreciation of some touch points being very integrated, sort of like at the core of every single experience, while others are basically used just by one person or not at all. And of course, the more the ecosystem is rendered in detail, the more insights you can get from any picture like that. And the final insights that we draw from this thing are always the fact that, first of all, cross-channel ecosystem identify a space of opportunity and not a thing that we build from scratch. There's a challenge there, some intervention that could be done, an opportunity to be taken, but not a thing that we build and say it's finished. That doesn't exist, right? And the second thing is that you don't really manage this thing. It's not an artifact that you can decide that you give to a client, but more like the idea that once you have identified a role, that's something that your client is interested in, has within the ecosystem, you can point out ways that this thing can be exploited. You want to be inside this, tax paying, tax filing ecosystem, well, you need to play along these rules. You could do this, you could do that, and you could try to change the way that the ecosystem works. Channels, touch points, and seams inside the general diagrams allow the designers to identify, for example, where you have bottlenecks or single points of failure or stragglers, touch points that the company wants to spend a lot of money on, but that nobody uses, right? Or that might be strategic if some other condition changed, right? Just like the supermarket thing. If that changes, maybe that thing might become more interesting. And you might find out that there are parts that are interesting but absolutely non-integrated into the way most of the people, most of the actors go through the ecosystem itself. We also have understood that experiences should be seamless. That's what we strive for, right? So the idea that we proceed unhindered to our goal. But that doesn't mean that the seams should be absolutely invisible or imperceptible. There are situations where actually having the bump in the road is actually very, very good. The typical example that we found out is when you move from a secure to an unsecure touch point. You want to know that, right? So I shouldn't stop you, but I should make it very clear, verbally, audibly, in any possible way, visually, that there's been a change and that's not the same situation. And the general strategic understanding of the ecosystem from this perspective is the one thing that allows you and eventually the companies you're working for to have a global understanding of the ecosystem that allows to build a pervasive information architecture that goes across the different elements. Mind you, the client you're working for, your company, will not own the ecosystem. You are going to be a part of the ecosystem. But this lack of control is going to be sort of like the only thing that you have at your disposal, and understanding that is going to be a great strength. The other way is just to be, out of the ecosystem and not play the game, which is not a good thing. The way you turn this understanding of the ecosystem into propositive design is because that understanding of the flows through the channels and the way they connect the different touch points through the seams will allow people to augment the information capability of the system because they add posts, lolcats, or interesting information through any means possible, and that increments the resilience of the ecosystem itself, making it more useful, making it more, fit to the tasks, making it capable of responding to more tasks in the long time. Point-to-point insights that you have, which are going to be there, can at that point absolutely turn into traditional business as usual intervention like we do every single day. But the thing is, at that point, you will not go into the project by saying, well, this is the app, This is what we need to do. This is the one thing. You will know that whatever you do with the app, the kiosk, the website, or training staff, or anything else, physical signage in an environment, you know that that's going to be playing a part in a much larger experience that is not company-bound and that is not company-controlled. Thank you.
Well done.
Just turn around. Just turn around. There you go.
Exactly. I set a challenge to Andrea every time he does a presentation. I set a challenge to him, like, I want you to have a slide where Cliff Richard is jumping over a shark. This time it was Batman. And,
but the story about Batman is true. We actually discussed that, so it was not made up.
it's kind of crazy stuff that happens in our minds.
Yeah.